Wonderful. Thanks very much. Okay, so we've been chatting a little bit, but I just do really want to say, well, first of all, Happy New Year, because for many of you, I haven't even had a chance to see you in this new year, or what even feels like the last year, because it's been a blur. I'm seeing names and faces that I haven't been able to connect with in a while. So a special shout out to Tom Potter, of course, because former colleague, well, not former, yeah, I mean, former colleague in the sense of we were both in outdoor rec before, and now only he is, I have to sadly not be in that same space, but happy for other reasons. Anyway, I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on this workshop that Dr. Tranter, David's going to be giving us on, you can all read the screen that's up there, but just on virtual teaching and wellness. And before I actually introduce David, I just want to be able to give you a little bit of a context of why we have arrived here. So my team in the Teaching Commons, as many of you are going to be aware of, and that's one of the benefits of COVID. Now everybody knows that there is a Teaching Commons, which is lovely. We're really grateful for that aspect. But my team has been, especially since our pivot to having to go online in such a rapid way, my team has been meeting with many of you, I'm sure, but our instructors and faculty across the university, and they shared with me sort of a pattern of what they were seeing emerge. And of course, at first it was just outright panic because we were having to pivot into online remote learning in ways that for many of us was not at all familiar, myself included. And then as the winter term wrapped up and we started moving into the spring and summer, they were getting a lot of feedback from instructors around, oh, okay, this wasn't quite as hard as I thought it was going to be. I'm going to be able to manage this. It's going to be all right. And then as we got further and further into the fall, just real fatigue was starting to set in around this reality of online instruction, remote learning, whatever version you've undertaken started to look like. And we just as a team had a lot of concern about what that meant. And so I knew that HR was already trying to offer as much kinds of supports and stuff as they could, but I reached out to talk to them and say, what else could we maybe do? Because my team and I are a bit concerned. And so we were aware of some of the work that David had been doing. And so we reached out to him to see if he could help us provide something to provide some tips and just create a sense of wellness and also, quite frankly, from my own heart, a sense of appreciation and acknowledgement of all of the efforts that are being put in to provide good learning experiences for our students. But I have to say also during that same time period, I happened across this article that was talking about how as faculty members, most of us, first of all, aren't trained as educators. Those that are in the Faculty of Education, that's a different sort of story. But for the rest of us, we kind of have learned by osmosis through sitting through many hours of lecture, etc. And maybe lots of us have undertaken some professional development in various forms as well. But really, we made our decisions around what we were doing because of what we liked or we didn't like from those that we were learning from at the time. And so it was kind of this osmosis, right? So even though we might have been in a serious panic the first time that we started teaching, there still at least was a foundation of familiarity because we've been that kind of student before. But this article went on to say, not many of us have sat through online learning environments in those kinds of ways. And so we are in this huge learning curve that really just is adding a layer of anxiety and stress and concern that we might not have otherwise had. And for many of us, we've been teaching for quite some time, so we haven't even been on that learning curve for a while, but we've been forced into it by the pandemic. And then just add on the layers that the pandemic is providing in terms of how that's impacting all parts of our life in different kinds of ways. I just really felt like we needed to just take a moment to maybe get some tips and strategies on how we could do things that will protect our own wellness, but obviously ultimately help our students too, because quite frankly, they're in the same boat as us. They haven't been these online remote learners either. And so I was really grateful that when I reached out to David, and I have to say, I said to him, worried about asking because everybody is really busy and I didn't want to add something else onto his plate. So I was super grateful that he was willing to be able to give us a little bit more time so that we could draw on his 22 years of experience at Lakehead as the associate professor in the School of Social Work, and his expertise in promoting mental health and well-being of children and youth that are in various educational settings. And not surprisingly, because of his focus in this kind of work, he has been asked to and has provided over 40 of these kinds of seminars for parents and caregivers and educators across Canada. So I feel really fortunate that we have someone with this level of experience and expertise that he can come and share his learning with us. And I know we can't really all clap, but if you can join me in welcoming David to providing this with us today, I really appreciate that. Thank you for those virtual hands. And so we've already indicated that the workshop is going to be recorded. I'm going to be monitoring the chat to help David out. So please feel free, and he's going to expand on this a little bit more, but I just wanted to say that I'll be monitoring that to help him out. And we're going to let him do his thing, and then we're going to hopefully enter into some robust discussion. Although he assured me that he's quite adept at managing the chat and doing his thing at the same time, which I'm barely able to walk and chew gum. So I'm just always amazed when this kind of stuff can happen. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Rhonda, and thank you for giving us some context for this and for that introduction. And thank you all for coming. I know, you're all really busy, and also you probably spend enough time online that you may not be necessarily wanting to spend even more time online doing this. So thank you for taking your time out. And I said this, unofficially at the beginning of this, but I'll say this officially as part of my presentation. I prepared something today to share my thoughts and my experience, but I really recognize that we could swap roles, and you have a lot to teach me about what your experience has been and what you've learned. So it's my turn today. Hopefully it'll be your turn next, but in no way am I, coming to you today as some incredible expert in terms of virtual teaching, although virtual teaching. And I hope if you asked my students, they would say that they're really enjoying my classes. I hope, fingers crossed. Currently I teach a couple of classes, all of whom have about just a little more than 60 students per class. But I've also taught grad classes that are more of a seminar discussion base. So a pretty good range, I think, of the smaller kind of intensive discussion, and then larger lecture breakout room, 3-hour long second year course, things like that. So, I mean, we all teach so many different types of classes. They all have their challenges, but I've had a chance to do lots of different things. So I'm going to launch into this, and as Rhonda said, feel free as you go. You know this. It's very lonely teaching virtually when you're on the screen. It's lovely for those of you put your screen on, although no pressure for the rest of you. It's cool. I don't make my students put their screen on if they don't want to. But what's really helpful, if you have a thought or an experience, is for you to share it in the chat. One of the many things I've discovered about virtual teaching that's a kind of a lovely surprise is that the chat function is serves some I can do some things with the chat that I couldn't do in the classroom. Ron and I were talking about this the other day. I've really noticed that my more introverted students who would have never said anything in a conventional classroom are willing to put some things in the chat. And I get to know them in a way almost better than if I was seeing them in person. And also, after you establish some basic trust in the classroom, I find that my students will really use the chat to play, to make comments, and they'll say, "You're on fire, David," and silly things like that. And that we can have a kind of a fun back and forth as well as cover the material. So I'm loving, some of these sort of, there's a lot of losses to virtual, learning, but there's some gains too. So I'm going to launch into this, and feel free if you're inspired to say anything to put it in the chat. So let's get started. I just wanted to again just thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rhonda, for inviting me and putting this on and having an opportunity as colleagues to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing. Quickly, I'll just say, as Rhonda indicated, my area is mental health and well-being, particularly with children and youth. I've had an interesting career path at Lakehead. I pretty early on, kind of thought, oh boy, I think I want to be the director of the school. And so I was the director of the school. I dabbled in being a dean for a year. I was the director actually for 8 years. I gotta be honest with you, in doing that, I realized that that was not my thing. It wasn't really, what I was best at, even though I really, really enjoyed it. I did do it for 8 years. But what's interesting is many of you know that when you take on an administrative role, it's hard to maintain your research and academic career at the same time. Maybe you've managed to pull that off. I never could. So I found myself saying, I don't think I want to go the administrative route. And so I found myself, having been at the university for probably, a dozen years, saying, oh my God, what do I do with the rest of my career? I kind of have to start all over again. But one of the things I was always passionate about, and all of my previous employment and all of my work was about mental health and well-being. Where I hadn't been smart enough to figure out is, where do I do that? But some fortunate things kind of occurred where I realized, the best place to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is where young people are. And young people are at home, but they don't appreciate if you go to their home and knock on their door and say, I'm here to help you with your mental health and well-being. They're also at schools. And there is a huge movement now, as many of you know, for educators to consider the mental health and well-being of their students, not just the academic side. And so kind of wrote a book. It was one of those things where you say, God damn it, someone needs to write a book about this. And then some things happened, and I had a chance to write a book with 2 teacher colleagues. And you kind of write a book I didn't think I would even survive writing a book. It goes out into the world, and now there's been this slow interest in this book that's growing and growing and growing and growing. And it's been, and a lot of it is about timing, right? A lot of it is this interest now that predates COVID, but about how do we support the well-being of our students in an academic setting without stepping out of our roles and becoming counselors or therapists or social workers. How do you do that within your role? And so that has been absolutely what I have lived and breathed for probably about 6-7 years now, completely, and I'm loving it, and I hope to do that until I pop my clogs. So that's kind of where I'm at. I want to start off with a little story, and you'll see where I'm going with this. But this relates to the pandemic and what we're experiencing as educators and in general. So one of and also, I guess it's a story I use a lot with educators, both primary educators and secondary educators, because they say, this is awful. This pandemic is just nothing but terrible. And so an interesting thing happened in Sweden in 1967. The Swedish government decided that it was time to go from the left-hand side of the road, driving on the left-hand side of the road, to driving on the right-hand side of the road. A lot of the adjoining countries were already on the right-hand side of the road, and they wanted to just be consistent with those countries. And so there was all kinds of experts that studied the problem and said, this is complicated. How do you get a whole country to slowly transition from driving on one hand side of the road to the other? And the one thing all the experts agreed on is you have to do it slowly and phase it in, and that it's going to be bad no matter what you do. It's going to be dangerous. In fact, most experts said, we probably shouldn't even do this because the fatalities, the accidents, the injuries that are happening are probably not worth it. It's just going to be too chaotic and too dangerous. But the Swedish government said, okay, thanks for the advice, experts, but we're going to do it, and we're going to do it in one day. So literally on September 2nd, 1967, everybody drove on the left-hand side of the road. On September 3rd, everyone drove on the right-hand side of the road. Nobody knew how to do it. They just said, figure it out. Well, that's a photo. That's a photo on your screen of that day. Of course, the experts were right. It was chaos. People were incredibly stressed. People were, had no idea how to get down the street. Cars were stopping. People were getting out, scratching their heads. And the experts were completely right that it was a mess. But they weren't right in another respect. Injuries, fatalities, even accidents, fender benders went down to virtually zero. The whole country was, a mess, but there weren't the injuries. There weren't even the fender benders. And in fact, compassionate driving, thoughtful, caring, mindful, considerate driving went up. Of course, everybody went from driving mindlessly to just doing what they've always done to having to think about their driving. And although it was a mess, everybody was kind and compassionate in their driving and stopped and let each other through. So it was a mess, but the experts were wrong. Nobody was injured, nobody was hurt. In fact, if you wanted to create safe driving, switch sides of the road every couple of weeks, and everybody would have to be on their game and be really careful. So I've been suggesting this to a lot of educators, saying this has been a mess, but it's a chance for us to think, what's really important in the work that we do? Instead of just driving the way we've always driven and just keep going, straight ahead, saying, well, this forces us to ask ourselves, what do our students really need from us the most? And it gets us really out of our comfort zone. But there's a kind of an opportunity to think carefully about our practices, despite the fact that it's a bit of a shit show. But we can think carefully. So I'll just plant that seed, and we'll come back to that later. So as I said, my thing's kind of mental health and well-being, and there's a couple of things I want to say about big ideas, clarifying what's true and what's not so true about well-being. So one of the things that's really true is that it's become very trendy now to talk about mental health and well-being and break the stigma. But there's a risk there that we just have posters and slogans and stuff on websites and pamphlets and even programs. But that is not how you promote mental health and well-being among students or adults, for that matter, too. It's people. The very famous psychiatrist Bruce Perry, who wrote this great book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, is the one who said, first, and foremost, programs don't change people, people change people. And so, all of those things are good, but it's going to be the people that change people. And definitely, I put that picture up, happiness is a choice. A lot of my students love to, go on social media and say things like, happiness is a choice and you go, girl, things like that. That's simply not true. You can't make girl go by telling go, girl. And also you can't get someone to be happy by telling them that it's a choice. In fact, the best way to make a depressed person even more depressed is to claim that that it's just your attitude that sucks. So we have a lot of misunderstanding. As much as our understanding of mental health has improved and there's a commitment to it, there's a lot of misinformation out there. The other one is this notion that you can just get well-being by working on it. Well-being, I like the concept that that should be well-being can't be pursued. You don't even want to peruse well-being, but it can't be pursued. It has to, and it ensues. It ensues from the experiences and the relationships that you have. And really, if you look at it, and I'm going to just briefly go through some of the research, but well-being isn't as hard to support in people as we think, because you don't have to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker to do it. You have to care about relationships in very simple and fundamental ways. One of my favorite things that I love to share with people is, especially because I'm 56, you'll see is the U curve of human happiness. And this is this interesting sort of truism. I think this study's been done in 177 studies now, 77 countries now, that mostly for our adult lives, we spend the first 30 years of our life with declining well-being. And then around 50, your well-being goes up. That's why I'm happy to be 56. I've had 6 great years. It's a fun thing to talk to my students about when they're 25, saying, oh my God, your life is screwed for another 20 or more years. And then we can talk about, why that is. That in and of itself is worthy of a conversation, but I do want to point out that if adults are called upon to support the well-being of young people, they have to first admit that they're often not very good at understanding what well-being is or supporting their own well-being, or else they wouldn't spend the first 30 years of their life with declining well-being. You would think that as we have experience, our well-being just goes up every year. But in truth, for most people, and you may be the exception, your well-being goes down slowly, but incrementally. And then you sort of begin to figure out what's important in life and live life on its own terms, and you do what you're passionate about. Admittedly, if you have children, they become more independent and you don't have to worry about them quite as much. And you start to have conversations about what matters most. I can remember, I don't want to go on too much about this, but I remember this Saturday, I have 3 kids. I remember this Saturday when I woke up and my kids were all old enough that I had nothing that I had to do on their behalf on that Saturday. They all had plans that didn't require me. And I had no idea what to do with myself. I just roamed around the house looking for someone to help, looking for someone to drive. I had so, invested my time and my identity in my in my children, but also in things like getting tenure and just establishing the fundamentals of your career. So there you go. So Karen, I think it is. You're not there yet. It was a strange Saturday because it was very unsettling. I felt like nobody needed me. But then the next Saturday and the next Saturday was like, okay, well, who are you? And what do you care about and what's important to you? And that actually is what this is all about, that when you start to go up the other side of the U curve of human happiness. We can do a whole talk about that. I won't do that. I'll just give you one more thing from the research that I think is worth knowing, which is the older you get, the more able you are be able to derive pleasure from small things. That's the other thing that the research shows, that if you're like me, a good cup of coffee is all you need to make you happy. It's like, oh my God, this coffee is great. Whereas if I was 25, I would drink the coffee and move on. But now it's like, I want to talk about the cup of coffee. This is good coffee, eh? We should have this again tomorrow. I can derive so much joy from something so small. And that's what the research shows, that, a good conversation, a good connection, some kind words from a friend, actually you get more well-being from that the older you get. Here's all you need to know about life. This is all you need to know about life. I share this with my students and say, if you want to beat the U curve of happiness, here's another scientifically, okay, there's nothing scientific about this at all, scientifically valid thing, that the older you get, the more you enjoy getting socks as gifts. Give a 16-year-old socks as gifts and they're like, ew. Give me socks as gifts and I'm like, this is the best. These are cozy. Thank you. And that too proves my point that small nurturing acts, as you get experience and perspective in life, actually, fill your cup more and more and more and more. And those are the kinds of things that, we need to continue to work on. The small things, not these big elaborate things. Okay. So to get back to some of the, the kind of researchy stuff. I know all of you know this, but oh, Susan, nice. See, you got socks over Christmas. It's wonderful to get socks over Christmas. Nice. So as you know, but I want I wanted to kind of put this out there in terms of why this is so difficult, right? That in terms of virtual learning, especially if you're relatively new to the virtual sort of teaching and learning game and the technology, is that, as we know, the challenge of teaching is, you could call it the zone of proximal development, or you could just call it the Goldilocks zone. It's to try to ensure that the difficulty level is just right. The problem, though, for educators, and the challenge for many students is that the challenges of technology push you out of that Goldilocks zone to make things too hard, too frustrating, too irritating, and so there isn't that nice balance between challenge, but not so much challenge that people start to give up. And I've got a slide in a second that will talk about some of the kinds of things that I'm hearing from students, and you may be hearing the same thing about, it's the technology, but also some of the obstacles that the technology presents to students and to the courses, is bumping them right out of the Goldilocks zone into the too hard kind of area. So in social work, we actually did a survey of our students to see how the fall term went. And that included, though, all students taking all social work courses, and in first and second year, those courses are open to non-social work students. So this doesn't just represent the social work students, but among the kinds of feedback that we got, and this is a non-scientific survey, it's just a survey, but that they were really wanting more interaction with the profs and their peers. There were many courses that were asynchronous, that meant that they didn't have any connection whatsoever. Oh,
yeah, how weird.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can hear you, Lise, but I guess maybe you can't hear us. Can anyone? Okay, I think everyone else is okay, except for these poor Lise. Too much self-guided learning, long exhausting Zoom sessions. You can read, that there is this sort of general feeling. And again, we also asked them what's going well, and there was things they had to say, but there was real struggle around not feeling connected and not feeling clear about what the expectations were, and feeling like they were struggling, but they weren't able to talk about those struggles, or in some cases have their professors available so those struggles could be addressed. So as probably all of you know, and sometimes what I feel badly about these kinds of events is you wouldn't be here unless you care deeply about your students and about being responsive to them. And so you're probably not the ones who should be at this talk today, because you're already doing the right things. It might be that it's some of the people who say, screw it, I don't want to be at a talk like that, it's not necessary. They're the ones who maybe would benefit from this conversation. Oh, thank you, Rhonda, for your feedback that you're hearing similar things. So it would be naive to say that our students are all fine and everything's great. They're stressed. If I in my class say, how are your classes going? I get a barrage in the chat. I go, whoa, okay, I wish I never asked. I get a barrage of frustrations and stress. And I don't want to put that all on us. It's a students, if you ask them how things are going, may be inclined to have a barrage of things to say at the best of times. But I think there's something there to what they're saying. A couple of quick key things in terms of research. We know now that that learning requires a sense of well-being, that as people are learning the cognitive stuff, the social emotional stuff is activated too, that there really is no way to say, I don't really care about your well-being, I'm just here to deliver content. If students have to feel good in order to learn well, those things now, this is a great study that I'm referring to, the evidence base for how we learn, this 28-member council of scientists that say, it's a ball that's all balled up into one thing. And you can't separate the kind of heart and the mind where learning is concerned. The other thing is, we know there's been a ton, and I'm sure so many of you know this, but there's been a ton of large scale reviews of research over the last decades, and said that, you know, you can't really be an effective teacher without connection, that the best teachers focus on connecting with their students. And you see in this slide, breaking it down a little bit, but probably many of you do this, but they're small but important things. I know when my students like make a face in class, I can say like, why'd you make that face? Like, I can see the wheels turning, what's going on? And that really opens up discussions. And then one of my favorite concepts that's really well supported by empirical research is this idea that, you know, anything you do with young people, and by young people, I mean people, let's say, you know, certainly up till age 25. So when I say young people, don't think we're talking about 12-year-olds only. There's this great study that reviewed all programs, academic and non-academic programs with young people, and argue that, you know, if the people in charge of that teaching or coaching or boys and girls clubs or you name it, you know, have good relationships with those young people, it will succeed. If they don't have good relationships, it could be a great program, or it could be a great curriculum, or it could be a great textbook that you're using, but it won't succeed. So I like very much the idea that relationships are the kind of catalyst, the active ingredient that supports learning and development. If I was to just summarize, though, the kind of key message here, it's something that I think increasingly we're appreciating in education, although admittedly, it's probably colleges and universities are picking up on this. Elementary schools picked up on this first. Secondary education is sort of saying, okay, I guess I'll form relationships with these teenagers. And now tertiary kind of college and universities are saying, oh, okay, tell me more about this, but I don't know if it's really my problem. And it's drifting into colleges and universities. But it's this simple kind of formula that if you want to support achievement, relationships will do it. If you want to support well-being, relationships will do it. So you don't really have to choose between sort of supporting well-being and achievement. And as I said, and you don't have to be a social worker or a psychologist to support well-being. You just have to make small efforts to connect with your students. So that's the bottom line. To promote well-being and achievement in your students, as well as promote your own well-being, we need to create virtual learning experiences that support rather than undermine well-being. We need to create connections. So in thinking about this today and planning for this, what I want to make clear to anyone who is interested is, to support well-being, we're not talking about elaborate or time-consuming acts. We're talking about small connections, small moments, small things, and to try to also reducing the number of things that undermine people's well-being. I know that Ann Kyander's on the call, or on this call, and she could say, I often use this, but she's the math expert, say, you know, you can teach math in a way that undermines a student's well-being. You can teach math in a way that doesn't undermine a student's well-being, and that's critical. So it's not about these elaborate programs, it's being mindful of how we teach our subject areas in a way that doesn't undermine well-being, and ideally supports it through different kinds of connections. So this is the beauty of Next, is I got 10 tips. So if you're thinking, when is this guy going to shut up? I only got 10 tips. So you can count down with me if you need to. So 10 tips to support student well-being in your own. The first tip is to be careful about planned continuation bias. So there is a recognized sort of phenomenon in human behavior. This, by the way, is a dating tip too, if any of you are thinking about dating, because once we have a plan and we start to execute that plan, we tend to just keep going with that plan. This is the notion of plan continuation bias. And that it's very hard for us to shift gears away from that plan once we have a plan in our heads. I've heard a lot of my colleagues in the community who are working in agencies saying, it's business as usual, people, it's business as usual. it's not business as usual. It's just not. And that would be planned continuation bias, to think that you can continue to kind of teach sort of like you did before the pandemic. You might just have to tweak it a little bit, but mostly you can just keep doing what you've always done. This challenges us to move to the other side of the road with our teaching, not simply to change our teaching a little bit. That dating tip, by the way, is why you can find yourself dating someone that you really shouldn't continue with, because you invest time in the first date, and the second date, and the fifth date, and the 10th date, and you're in. Then you're in, and you just keep going instead of saying, I need to pull out. So this human nature. So first of all, we have to be so careful about the fact that our tendency is to want to kind of keep doing what we do. The second one I've already alluded to is this really critical thing, because sometimes there's, you tell people you have to change your plan and say, I don't have time. Oh my God, I don't have time. We're talking about experimenting with small changes, small things. If there's something that comes up again and again and again in the change literature, it's that you focus on small changes. This, by the way, it's a great, very accessible book. Often I encourage my students to read it when their study habits are not the best, to get them to think about small changes to improve their daily habits and routines. But the other thing is small experiments with doing things a little bit differently. The other one is, I was thinking about how hard it is for a lot of people to make this transition, because they've just kind of made this transition sort of talking into their laptop, hoping they can figure it out. I have a pretty elaborate setup here. I have 2 big screens. I have ring lights. I'm in a room with soundproofing. It's a part of, now granted, I'm that's the other good thing. Have 3 kids, have most of them move out. You suddenly have bedrooms you can turn into little studio space. But I think of, online learning as a kind of a bus that I'm taking my students on the bus and off we go. But if my bus, the way I teach, the technology that I have, if it's not organized, and if I don't really know how to drive it, then it's not going to be a fun journey. The bus is going to break down. I'm going to curse. I'm going to not even really know how to shift gears. So I know, again, many of you do this, but it's so vital to find some sort of arrangement, given what you have available to you, so that you can, settle down and kind of do this in a way that's right, rather than, and again, because it simply creates stress, rather than saying, well, I'm going to flip up my laptop, I'm going to open up this Zoom thing, and I'm just going to hope for the best. It's so much easier if you're in a position to really kind of organize your space. So get your vehicle, working for you. And kind of like the Sweden story, I really think this is an opportunity for us to focus on what matters most. I have noticed, again, Rhonda and I were talking about this the other day, that in the fall, I noticed in planning my courses virtually, I just couldn't cover as much content. And so I had to reduce quite a lot of content that I normally cover. And guess what? It didn't matter. A lot of that content that I was covering, I realized I was covering it because I always cover that, and realizing I actually don't have to cover some of this stuff. I think that there's a common thing that many of us fall victim to, which is to every year add more to the course and more to the course and more to the course. This has required me to strip the course down to its bare essentials and say, what are the things that matter most to this course? What do I want to make sure my students walk away knowing? And that's been really liberating, because I've been able to let go of things that have just kind of seeped into that course, the kind of content curriculum creep phenomenon, kind of cull these courses of all that stuff that's creeped in and focus on really the things that I want my students to learn more than anything else from this course. And one of the advantages, and I'm sure many of you are in this position, but one of the advantages I have, and others do, is I have a son right now who is 21. He's taking courses at Lakehead online. And so it's, whenever I'm inclined to say, oh, my stupid students, they don't know what, even how to get on my course link. I can always remember, but from my son's perspective, what it's like to be him trying to navigate right now 5 asynchronous courses, 5 confusing course outlines, 5 textbooks that he's just given, and say, well, there'll be a test on this one day. And so it's been a really good reminder to me to think about what this is like as a student, because I have one in my house, but I shouldn't necessarily need one in my house in order to do that. But I'm a lot more empathic toward it and just asking my students more about how it's going, what are your frustrations, and instead of when a student says to me, I can't get on my course link, or not even that, this happened to me the other day, what is my course link, and where is it? I want to say, not my problem, or I want to ignore the email altogether and say that's their problem. But I've got a lot better at saying, in fact, I created a little video that I send out to my students saying, here's how you access my course link. Here's how you get into the site. Here are all the critical tabs and the things you want to look for. And I just send it to them. It's a nice little screencast voiceover where I go through and so I've become better at always just patiently explaining everything to my students rather than thinking, you should know this. They're just super stressed. The other thing, I don't know if any of you are Brene Brown fans, but if you're in social work, you have to be a Brene Brown fan. That is a legal requirement of being in social work. She's a social worker. I love her saying, clear is kind, and the other half of that saying, unclear is unkind. So again, I am talking, I'm sure, to the wrong people here when I say, how vital it is that all of our course outlines, all of our communication has to be painstakingly clear, not just because it's, there's that notion of the curse of knowledge that we just think, well, this is obvious to anyone else because it's obvious to us, but also because our students are so stressed that things that they might otherwise know clearly or be able to navigate through stresses them out, their brain shuts down, and they can't think it through. So again, my kind of promise to myself this year has been to be painstakingly clear in everything I do. As I said, in every resource, even to the point of, to that, and I know there are reasons why people don't want to do this, and that's cool, but I do live lectures synchronously, but I watch them and watch them and watch them. And I've just upgraded my course line and all my constant emails to my students to walk them through everything. Even this term, and I'm sure many of you do this all the time, but I used to be the kind of person the prof would say, that's not my problem, but I email them saying, we have a class today, it's at 2:30. Here's the Zoom link again. I sent it to you 2 weeks ago, but here's it again. I'm really looking forward to seeing you there. Don't forget, we have another one on Wednesday. Just really, really, really clear. See, look, we're on number 7. We're in home stretch. Another great book, Power of Moments, by the Heath brothers. They've written lots of good books, Made to Stick and others. The Power of Moments is really good. One of the things, for example, what they say is, right, life is nothing but a bunch of moments, and that it's really important that we maximize the impact of those moments. If you want proof of why that's so important, you think about what are people calling the days of the week during the pandemic? Blur's Day. Today's Blur's Day, tomorrow's Blur's Day, the day after that's Blur's Day. That's because each day is just foggily looking like the next. Well, for me, but more importantly for my students, there is, they need moments so that the week feels like a week, so that every day doesn't feel like the day before. And that's the beauty, I think, of synchronous teaching, is at least they know that on this day at this time, this moment is happening. But also then within my class, I've been thinking a lot more about how do I create moments in my class so that it isn't just, and this falls into my next tip, but it isn't just sort of the same. So I've used polls, I use the breakout groups, I love Kahoot. I make sure that the content, some of the content is more personally relevant to them. And I'm just playing with this stuff. I am no expert, but creating, moments throughout the class rather than just a kind of class as a blur, and thinking about, as I said, moments throughout the term where, rather than every class is just like the one before. Thinking about what is the arc of my class? What am I building to? What kind of knowledge do I want them to then culminate? And how do we celebrate that knowledge that they've got? And then how do we move on? So I'd really encourage people to take a look at that book if you want. It's a great book. And one of the things they also say in that book that I thought I would just make a separate tip because it's so powerful is just fight the flatness. Again, we look back at what a lot of the feedback to students have been around, even Zoom learning, never mind the asynchronous stuff, just saying it just feels dull. It feels flat. One of the things that you probably all know is that even to talk on Zoom, to teach on Zoom, you have to amplify your personality. You can't just say, all right, class, today we're going to cover this. You have to go, hi, everybody, and really amplify. It might not be your style, and that's fine. But amplifying your personality a little bit goes a long way, because the screen, apart from adding 10 pounds, it takes at least 10% of your personality away. So you've got to think about how do you fight the flatness, but that also goes back to the kind of moments thing. And it goes a long way. I was telling Rhonda, of course, my students aren't allowed to send any of the recorded lectures around. But despite that, there's a kind of the thing that happened to me in the fall that I thought was funny. Because as you get, probably a lot of my students will say, is this on the test? And I'll usually kind of yell into the camera, yes, it's on the test of life. Well, someone actually cut that, like snipped that out and sent it out through social media of me yelling into the camera, yes, it's on the test of life, which I was really pleased with. I mean, considering all the other things they could have sent, that's not so bad. But it's that kind of thing, trying to get their attention. Two more. I know you all know this, but I mean, when you're stressed and you're trying to navigate Zoom learning, it's hard to feel happy and relaxed and comfortable. But everything we know about learning and education, there is no way of getting around this. It has to feel positive. It has to be a positive experience. It is no longer possible to say, I don't care if my class is fun. They're not here to have fun. When I say fun, I mean a positive environment, a positive experience. That's an essential element to that ingredient of relationship. But I recognize that it's hard to have fun when you're just learning new technology and maybe your internet's shutting down and things are freezing and all of that. That's not fun. But it's important, therefore, to remember, how can I try to get back to a little fun when I feel so stressed? And number 10, my favorite, and this is kind of what among my favorite quotes, and I think what this is all about. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius said a quote that you've probably heard before: the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. I've always loved this quote because it's a nice flip. Whenever you meet an obstacle, you realize maybe this is the thing that's going to teach me some really important lessons. And so I would argue that the pandemic, for all kinds of reasons, is a chance. I mean, it is a hell of an obstacle. It's an impediment to action, but it really is an opportunity, I would argue, for us to use this as a way to learn about who our students are, what do they really need from us, what really matters where my teaching is concerned, what am I truly passionate about, and how can I kind of be a better person and a better educator, given all that's gone on. So that's the other thing I wanted to end with, is that as much as these things are difficult, just looking at the chat too, they have a lot that they can teach us individually. And then I'll end with one final slide. So let's go back to Sweden. Um, I'm a big Latin fan, and my 21-year-old is really a massive Latin nerd. So I'm with you, Dave. So let's go back to Sweden. So this is the lesson of Sweden. You know, they all flipped to the other side of the road. Things got chaotic, but the injuries never happened. People were thoughtful. You know, they got out of their cars and they saw each other like human beings for the first time in years. It's like, I don't want to bump into you. You're a person. I want to get to know you. And so that's a beautiful story of humanity finally kind of recognizing itself. But there's another side to this, which is that within a year, everybody went back to their normal way of driving, because after a year, it became automatic again. They learned how to drive on the right-hand side of the road. They got comfortable. It became a mindless activity again. And all of the safety of driving, all of the compassionate humanity of driving was lost. And within a year, accidents, injuries, and fatalities were right back up to the way things were before. So I would end with this. This is an opportunity for us to learn. There is the risk, though, that we will just say, damn, I hope this is over soon, so I just go back to the way I was doing things before, rather than that would be the normal human thing to do. But it's a chance also for us to let this change us and our approach to education, and change us for the better, and change us, you know, permanently. So I think that's our challenge. Let's not be Sweden. Let's see if we can sort of make a change that lasts. Okay, 1:57. I've gone on way longer than I should have. I will stop it at that kind of challenge to us all, and certainly to myself. But thanks all for listening, and thank you for the comments. And I know there are people who have to go because they have other meetings and things like that. And of course, that's terrific, and go do what you got to do. But thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, David, and Susan, thanks for putting up a hand clap. I was just going to say, if you can all join me in thanking David for giving us this insightful opportunity, moments to smile and laugh. And I noticed a lot of shaking heads in agreement around what you were saying, David. And I guess I know people might have to run really quick, but was there anybody that had a question or a comment that they wanted to share quickly before we went? Because there wasn't anything that came up in the chat that you didn't already see, David. Go ahead, Lori, please.
I just wanted to say, David, I came to this session because you were leading it, because I have had experience in the past with learning from you and listening to you. And I wanted to thank you for sharing so many tips of wisdom, and also drawing in from other experts to share your wisdom. So thank you.
My pleasure. And again, thank you, Lori, and for all of you for coming and listening and being patient and, you know, hearing me out. And again, I'm probably not saying anything that you wouldn't say, or if the circumstances weren't flipped around. So I appreciate that too.
Not seeing necessarily any other. I had one quick question, David, and this might not be applicable within this group at all. As you've been saying, we probably are speaking to a lot of the choir, as the saying goes. But I was just wondering if you might want to make a comment on this idea of relationship within a classroom, because I think sometimes that can feel a little bit daunting as a faculty member. And what does relationship mean? Does it mean friendship? Does it mean something else?
That's a really good question. I probably should have addressed that. So thank you, Rhonda. So there's a couple of things that I would say are really vital. It doesn't mean spending more time with your students. It doesn't mean friendship. And I would also argue it doesn't even mean, hey, let's go for coffee. It doesn't mean, we're not talking about the quantity of time spent together. We're talking about the quality of time spent together. I know, again, given that I have reasonable sized classes, if someone said, well, you really have to get to know and spend a lot of time, like maybe set up individual Zoom appointments for each of your students and ask them how was their childhood? What did they like to do? I'd never be able to pull that off. There's just not enough hours in the week. it really is about making connections when you can. So just, and stuff that all of you are probably doing, but I just think about the small things that, first of all, when my students say something in the chat, I respond to it by name and say, okay, Susan, that was a really good point. That's so true. And then I say something about it. But let's say Susan says a couple of more things. I'll say, Susan, do you want to turn on your, your mic and talk about this a little bit? So that I'll get to know them through that. And just, it's just about, again, it's not about having these big, long, elaborate, relationships with people. But it's about making human to human connection, when you can. And I know people probably know this, but that goes a really, really long way with students. Just having their name mentioned and then saying, or maybe they say something silly in the chat and then I say something kind of playful back to them, but connect. So I do want to say that it's not about friendship. It's not about, changing the appropriate boundaries that you have between you and your students. And it's not even about spending more time. It's about using the time that you have to create moments of connection, of real person to person, authentic kind of connection. So yeah, thanks for that question. That's really important.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that. Making those deposits, as Jill says. Yes, absolutely.
That's right. It's yes, because Jill was at something earlier this week, and yes, deposits are so important. And withdrawals are good too, as long as you have lots of deposits. Yeah.
Right. Got something to withdraw from.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Does anybody have anything else that they would like to share before we let everyone go, and David in particular to? I'm not seeing any mics go off or hands go up, so I think maybe we are okay. Thanks very much, David. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to share this with everyone. And I think the only thing that I would add on top of all of the wonderful tips that David has given us today is not only do we want to have kindness for our students when we are responding to them on the various questions they have, but please have kindness for yourself, because we're all trying our very darndest best within the situation that we are in, and we're not always kind to ourselves in accepting the little mistakes and errors, etc., that we make. So don't forget that part of it too. And I mean, David certainly mentioned that, but it was just a piece that I wanted to pull out and say from my position. And as he said too, I would just like to echo the fact that you are here looking for tips and an opportunity to learn more is an indication of how committed you are to our students, and they are lucky to have all of you at the heads of their Zoom class, I guess, whatever metaphor might work in terms of these virtual spaces that we are in. Anyway, thanks everybody. I hope that you are doing well. The weekend is around the corner. I hope you'll have some time for yourself to enjoy a small moment to have a good cup of coffee or a nice hike if the weather is still nice or something like that. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.